Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The torchlight flickered against the cold stone walls of the throne room, casting long shadows across the empty hall. Emperor Aras sat slouched on the high-backed throne, his hand gripping the worn armrest, as if the mere act of holding onto something solid could stop the slow decay consuming his body. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his once proud frame had withered into a ghost of the warrior he had once been. The room felt hollow, much like the empire he ruled once. The Solan Empire had stood as a beacon of strength, its banners flying high over conquered land. Now it was nothing more than a dying beast beset by famine, rebellion, and war. Aras could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, and he could feel himself crumbling under the strain. The sword Soul Devourer lay across his lap, its blade dark and cold to the touch. It had been with him for years now, sustaining him when nothing else could. Aras hated the thing, but he couldn't deny its power. The sword whispered to him low and insidious, promising salvation, offering strength where he had none. A voice broke the silence. "Your Majesty." Aras slowly lifted his head, his eyes focusing on the figure that stood before him. It was Celine, the sorceress who had given him the sword in the first place. She was draped in shadows, her dark cloak billowing around her, as if it had a life of its own. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, gleamed from beneath the hood. "You look worse than the last time I saw you," she remarked with a hint of amusement in her voice. Aras clenched his jaw. "What do you want?" "I come to remind you of the pact you made," Celine said, her voice smooth, almost mocking. "The Empire is falling apart, and yet you sit here on your throne clinging to life with that cursed blade, like a dying man clutching at straw." Aras stared at her, his eyes filled with a mix of fury and despair. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't see you? This empire slipping through my fingers every day." Celine's silhouettes curled into a smile. "Then act Emperor, use the power you haven't been given. You then barely scratched the surface of what Soul Devourer can do." The sword seemed to pulse in his hand, its hilt growing warm as if reacting to her word. Aras had used its power, but only sparingly, for every time he drew on it, he felt something inside him erode. His soul, or whatever remained of it, was being chipped away, consumed by the sword, sense hunger. "I can tell," Aras muttered, his voice hoarse. "It shall too dangerous." Celine stepped closer, her voice softening. "It's dangerous not to use it. The Empire is crumbling, and soon there will be nothing left to save." "Is that what you want, to die as the last Emperor of Solan, watching everything you built fall into dust?" Aras lowered his gaze, his grip tightening on the sword. He had no choice. If he didn't act, the Empire would fall, but if he continued down this path, he feared he would lose himself entirely. "What do I have to do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Celine's smile widened. "You already know the answer. You must embrace the darkness. Feed the sword. Only then will you have the power to save your empire." Aras hesitated for a moment, then slowly nodded. He had already made the pact years ago when he had first taken the sword into his hand. There was no turning back now. The next day, Aras summoned his generals and advisors to the War Council chamber. The room was filled with maps and battle plans, all detailing the various rebellions and invasions threatening to tear the Empire apart. His most trusted general, Lorien, stood at the head of the table, his brow furrowed as he studied the report. "We were losing ground in the west," Lorien said, his voice grim. "The rebels have taken 3 more cities, and our forces are stretched too thin to hold them back." Aras, standing at the head of the table, felt the weight of the Empire pressing down on him again. His body felt frail, weaker with every passing day, but inside him the sword pulsed, feeding off his anger, his desperation. "We must make a decisive move," Aras said, his voice more steady than he felt. "We can't keep playing defense. It's not time to strike back." Lorien glanced up at him, his expression wary. "With all due respect, Your Majesty, we don't have the manpower for a full offensive. Our soldiers are exhausted, and morale is low." Art's hand tightened around the hilt of Soul Devourer, hidden beneath his cloak. "Then we will give them something to rally behind." Lorien frowned, confusion flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" Aras turned to Celine, who stood quietly in the shadows of the room. She stepped forward, her presence commanding attention as she spoke. "The Emperor has been granted new power. With it, we will crush the rebels and restore order to the Empire." Murmurs spread through the room, the generals exchanging uneasy glances. They knew of Selena's influence, and though they followed ours, they had always been wary of the dark magic she wielded. Lorien's frown deepened. This is madness. We cannot rely on sorcery to save the Empire. Ars slammed his hand on the table, the sharp sound cutting through the murmur. We have no choice. The Empire is dying, and you would have us sit here and do nothing. I will not let Solon fall under my rule. The room fell silent. Lorien stared at him, the lines of his face etched with doubt, but he said nothing more. Ars took a deep breath, steadying himself. Prepare the army. We march at dawn. As the army gathered at the city gates the following morning, Ars stood at the front, his armor gleaming under the pale light of the rising sun. The soldiers looked to him with a mixture of fear and reverence. They had heard rumors of the Emperor's strange new power, whispers that spread like wildfire through the ranks. Ars' hand rested on the hilt of Soul Devourer, its dark presence pulsing at his side. The sword seemed to hum with anticipation, eager for the blood it would soon taste. The gates creaked open, and the army began to march, their banners fluttering in the wind. Ardez rode at the front, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He knew what awaited him: battle, bloodshed, and more souls for the sword to consume. As they approached the rebel stronghold in the west, the tension in the air grew thick. The walls of the fortress loomed ahead, and Ard could feel the sword's hunger growing with every step. The battle would be fierce, and many lives would be lost, but the sword whispered to him, promising victory. The battle began with a thunderous roar. Ars led the charge, his sword cutting through the enemy like a hot knife through butter. The rebels fell before him, their screams drowned out by the clash of steel and the crackle of magic. But with every swing of the sword, Ars felt something inside him shift. The sword was feeding not just on the lives of his enemies, but on his own soul. The darkness within him grew, and with it, so did his power. He could feel it coursing through his veins, filling him with a strength he had never known. The battle raged on, and soon the fortress was overrun. Ars stood amidst the carnage, his chest heaving with exertion. Blood dripped from the blade of Soul Devourer, pooling at his feet. He had won. But as he looked around at the bodies strewn across the battlefield, a cold realization washed over him. The victory had come at a cost. Every life taken by the sword had chipped away at his humanity, leaving him hollow. Selene appeared beside him, her voice low and soothing. You see, Emperor, with the power of the sword, you are unstoppable. Ars didn't he respond? He could feel the darkness gnawing at him, eating away at what little remained of his soul. He had saved the Empire, but at what cost? Back in the capital, word of Ars' victory spread like wildfire. The people hailed him as a hero. The savior of Solon statues were erected in his honor, and the streets filled with celebration. But Ars found no joy in their praise. The sword was always there, whispering, feeding, and he could feel his control slipping. Lorien, however, was not fooled by the Emperor's newfound strength. He had seen the toll the dark power was taking on Ars, and he feared what it might mean for the future of the Empire. One evening, after a particularly brutal council meeting, where Ars had ordered the execution of several rebel sympathizers, Lorien confronted him. Your Majesty, Lorien said, his voice low and tense, this path you re on is not the way. The Empire may be safe for now, but at what cost? You've changed. Ars turned to him, his eyes cold and distant. I've done what needed to be done. The Empire is stronger than ever. Lorien shook his head. No, Ars, we're not saving the Empire. You read destroying it from within. The people may praise you now, but they fear you. They see what you have become. Ars stepped forward, his hand tightening around the hilt of Soul Devourer. What I've become is necessary. Lorien, this Empire will not fall because I will not allow it. Lorien's hand hovered near the hilt of his own sword, his heart pounding in his chest. He had served Ars for years, had fought beside him in countless battles. But now, standing before the man he had once called friend, he saw only a hollow shell consumed by darkness. Ars, please, Lorien said, his voice barely a whisper. There's still time. You can walk away from this. Ars' eyes narrowed, the shadows in the room seeming to deepen as he drew Soul Devourer from its sheath. There's no turning back. Lorien's heart sank as Ars drew Soul Devourer. He could feel the malevolent energy radiating from the cursed blade, pulsing in time with the Emperor's steady breath. The man who stood before him was no longer the friend he had once known. Lorien's hand hovered near his own sword, but he knew he wouldn't be fast enough. Soul Devourer was hungry. Ars stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as shadows danced around the edges of his face. You think you can stop me, Lorien? You think you can defy me now after everything I've done for this empire? Lorien held his ground, his voice trembling but resolute. This isn't TUR. This is the sword talking. The empire are people. They need a leader, not a monster. The words seemed to strike something in ours, and for the briefest moment, the darkness in his gaze flickered. But the sword pulsed again, louder this time, and Ur's grip tightened. The empire needs strength. I'm its strength. With a blur of motion, Ar swung the blade, and Lorien barely had time to draw his own sword to parry the strike. The force of the blow sent a shock wave through the air, knocking over a nearby brazier and casting the chamber into a hellish glow. Metal clashed, sparks flying as Lorien fought to defend himself against the onslaught. Movers moved with unnatural speed, his strikes relentless, each one fueled by the sword's insatiable hunger. Lorien's arms ached under the weight of each parry, his muscles straining to keep up. He had fought beside us for years, but never had he seen him like this. More beast than man, his every movement driven by rage and power. You rate a fool, Lorien, Ar snarled, his voice deep and twisted. You don't understand what's at stake. The empire will fall without me. The empire will fall because of you, Lorien shouted, lunging forward in a desperate attempt to disarm his friend. But Ar sidestepped the attack effortlessly, twisting the blade with a vicious precision that sent Lorien sprawling to the ground. Ars loomed over him, soul devourer, glowing with a dark, sinister light. The sword seemed to vibrate with anticipation, hungry for more. Lorien, his body trembling, struggled to rise, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He knew this was the end. His friend was gone, consumed by the very power he had sought to wield. Ars raised the sword high, and for a moment, the room seemed to freeze. Lorien looked up at the man he had once called king, his eyes filled with sorrow. Ars, he whispered, "Do not do that." Ars hesitated, his hand shaking as the sword hovered above. Lorien said, The shadows around him flickered as if the darkness itself were wavering. Somewhere deep inside, Ars could still hear the echoes of the man he had once been, the man who had fought for his people, who had sworn to protect them. But the sword whispered louder, drowning out the last remnants of his humanity. With a roar, Ars brought Soul Devourer down. Lorien's scream echoed through the hall as the blade pierced his chest. Ars felt the surge of dark power flood through him, the sword devouring Lorien's cell with a savage hunger. His friend Ard's body crumpled to the floor, lifeless as the last vestiges of light in the room faded. Ars stood over the corpse, panting heavily, the weight of what he had done pressing down on him like a suffocating shroud. He had won. He had saved the empire, but as he looked down at Lorien's lifeless form, all he could feel was the hollow emptiness grunting at his inside. The sword hummed in his hand, its hunger momentarily sated, but Louise knew it wouldn't last. The sword always hungered for more. He turned away from Lorien's body, walking toward the window at the far end of the chamber. Outside the city of Erin glittered in the distance, its lights shining like stars against the darkened landscape. The people were celebrating his victory, unaware of the true cost of their salvation. Ars rested his hand on the windowsill, staring out at the horizon. The empire had been saved, but at what cost? The price had been too high, his soul, his friends, his humanity. And yet, despite everything, the sword still called to him, still whispered promises of more power, more control. Celine appeared beside him, her voice a soft whisper in the darkness. It's undone, Emperor. The rebellion is crushed. The empire is yours. Hakras didn't respond. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, anger, regret, despair. He had become the very thing he had sworn to destroy. The sword had promised him power, and it had delivered, but in the end, it had taken everything from him. Celine, Santan rested lightly on his shoulder. You've done what was necessary. You've saved your people. I've damned myself, Ars muttered, his voice hollow. Celine's eyes glimmered with a strange intensity. The pact has been fulfilled, but there, still more you can achieve. The sword can make you even stronger, Ars. You could rule this empire for eternity. Ars turned to face her, his expression hardening eternity. He scoffed, What kind of ruler would I be if I am no longer human? Celine's smile was thin and sharp, a ruler who cannot be defeated, a ruler who cannot die. Ars shook his head, turning back to the window. I've had enough of your lies, Celine. I can feel the sword consuming me. Peace, By peace, there's nothing left to rule if I lose my soul. Celine's smile faltered, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. You knew the cost when you made the pact. Ours, there's no turning back now. Ours' gaze hardened, and he stepped away from her, his hand gripping Soul Devourer tightly. Maybe not, but I can choose how this ends. Without warning, Ours turned and swung the sword in a wide arc, the blade slicing through the air with deadly precision. Celine's eyes widened in shock, but she was too slow to react. The sword cut through her form, her body disintegrating into a swirl of shadows and smoke. Her final scream echoed through the chamber as she vanished into the darkness, leaving Ars alone once more. For a moment there was silence. Ars stood in the center of the chamber, his chest rising and falling with heavy breath. He stared at the spot where Celine had stood, his mind racing. She was gone, but the sword remained, its power coursed through him, stronger than ever, but so too did the darkness. He looked down at the sword in his hand, the blade gleaming with an unnatural light. It had been his salvation, but now it was his curse. Ars took a deep breath, his decision made. With a swift, deliberate motion, he lifted the sword above his head, the weight of it heavy in his grip. He could feel the sword, Serge's resistance, its dark energy surging against him, but he wavered. With a roar of defiance, Ars brought the sword down with all his strength, driving it into the stone floor beneath his feet. The blade shattered on impact, a deafening crack echoing through the hall as shards of dark metal scattered across the room. The sword's power dissipated instantly, the darkness that had clung to Ars for so long lifting like a weight from his chest. He fell to his knees, gasping for breath, his body trembling as the last remnants of Soul Devourer's influence faded away. For the first time in years, Ars felt free. But the price had been steep. His body, weakened by years of relying on the sword, Scythe's power began to fail. He could feel his strength, leaving him, his vision dimming as the world around him grew darker. Ars collapsed to the floor, his breath shallow, the weight of his actions pressed down on him, but there was no regret. He had made his choice, and in the end he had reclaimed his soul. As the light in the room faded to black, Ars closed his eyes, a faint smile on his lip. The Fallen King was at peace.